Great. Holy War. Nutshell, message of the book. So, I remember, really struggling with, back in the day, kind of Israel's encounter with Canaan in the Old Testament. A lot of folks today would say, it's genocide. Particularly, there's verses that are used like show no mercy, utterly destroy them, leave nothing alive that breathes. And obviously, there's a lot there to unpack, but maybe a synopsis would go. I think that what's happening in Old Testament Holy War is actually something that is radically different, very paradigm shift on what we usually think of when we think of Holy War, that it actually confronts many of the ways that we tend to think of Holy War in our world. So, for example, we tend to think of Holy War as the strong using the gods or God to justify their conquest of the weak. So throughout history, you have the Incan and the Aztecs and Chinese and the Mongols, the Greeks and the Romans, cultures and peoples throughout history going to battle and claiming the gods are in our corner of the fight ring backing us up. And it's sort of the strong, right, who are going in and fighting. But in Israel's story, it's kind of the opposite, right? Like they are slaves going up against the mightiest empires of the ancient world, Egypt and the imperial powers of Canaan. They don't have the weaponry, it's not like there was a stockpile of AK-47s in the desert when they kind of came out of Egypt. They are going up against horses and chariots that were kind of the equivalents of like tanks and jet fighters back then, kind of the most highly weaponized, militarized, with defensive fortresses and all that. And Israel has got virtually nothing. And so they don't have the weapons. They don't have the strategy. The strategies are ridiculous. Like, you get to Jericho, and it's like, hey, march around the city, 7 times and blow trumpets, 7 days and blow trumpets. It's a really bad battle strategy. If you think of, like, the Allied forces invading Normandy and, like, with rock guitars and drums or something, it would be a bad idea. And so I kind of trace how throughout Israel's encounter with Canaan, the battle strategies are repeatedly ridiculous, and I think they're designed to show that God is ultimately the one who's really doing the fighting, not Israel. That Israel is kind of the last, the least. They're depicted as kind of the weakest, the least in the ancient world, and God is, it's not so much the strong using God to justify the conquest of the weak, it's God rising up on behalf of the weak against the tyranny of the strong when it's raged for far too long. So that's one piece. I try and take a closer look at what's going on with some of the strong language, what I would call sort of drastic marching orders, the show no mercy, utterly destroy them type stuff. And 3 observations there that I've found helpful. One is the language is being used for cities. And when cities in that day were military cities, the kind of Hebrew word and context there, when we think of cities today, I live in Portland and I walk outside my front door and it's a neighborhood with children running around and there's a school down the street and hospitals and restaurants and all. So when we think of city today, we tend to think of a civilian population center. But in the ancient Middle East, cities were kind of these small fortified military outposts. Archaeologists suggest there were probably no more than 200 soldiers at Jericho, sort of this fortified outpost defending the way up into the countryside where the bulk of the people lived. And so as Israel is kind of taking out these cities, they're knocking out military fortresses, not ravaging civilian population centers. So it's they're taking out the Great Wall of China, not Beijing, right? Or going up against the Pentagon, not New York City. So military cities, the second observation is that in the ancient world, there's what I would call ancient trash talk, that kind of the way people in the ancient Middle East talked about war. You can look at accounts from all over the era, and the way that people described war was with this kind of drastic, drastic rhetoric and language of, we destroyed them all, we wiped them all out, there was no one left, and kind of describe it to like if you're in a basketball locker room after the game, and you hear the team talking, they're like, man, we annihilated them. There was nothing left. They couldn't get a thing past us. They slaughtered them. We wiped the floor with them. They had nothing on us. And if you took their language verbatim, literally, you would walk out thinking, man, the score was like 120-0. But then you hear actually, it was 120-105. Like it was a decisive victory, but not as drastic as the language alone would lead you to believe. And in the Old Testament, I think the Old Testament makes clear itself that it's using the language this way, because there's really only 2 battles where the language shows up afterwards, where they're going, dude, we did this. And in both of them, the very same enemies that were supposedly wiped off the planet are right back there again within a few chapters and causing just as much trouble as ever. Joshua 9-12 is one of those places where all the kings of northern Canaan and all the kings of southern Canaan rally their forces and their troops, and they're going to snuff out Israel. And Israel's kind of defensively going, okay, how do we defend ourselves? And we're about to get slaughtered. And this is the famous story where the sun and the moon stand still and the hailstones come from heaven, and God arises to fight and defend his people. And when the battle's done, Joshua and his troops are charged, and they're like, dude, we utterly destroyed them. We showed no mercy, all that language. And he's describing it for all of Canaan, all the kings of the land of Canaan. But we're only in Joshua. And within a few more chapters, then there's the book of Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. Like up until the reign of David, the encounter with Canaan is still going on. And so it's very clear to the Hebrew audience within the Old Testament that it's not to be taken literally. It's this exaggerated war rhetoric. So military cities, not civilian population centers, kind of ancient trash talk, the genre of literature and how they talked about war. And the third and final one would just be that the primary language that's used is that of eviction, not murder. It's the language of Canaan being driven out of the land, not killed off. The drastic marching orders only show up in like 4 places, 2 battles, and then a few places describing it. But the driving them out language shows up over 50 times in the Old Testament. So it's the dominant image where God's going gradually over generations between Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, up until the reign of David. There's kind of this gradual expulsion of Canaan from the land. And I think the picture there is one where God has been patient for centuries as they sort of established their dominance in the area, but they've kind of this corrupt, powerhouse, wicked empire, and God is now kicking them out of his garden and handing it over to kind of the last and the least of the ancient world, his nation, as sort of homeless, wandering slaves. Ultimately, I think to send a message to the ancient world that I stand for the vulnerable, the exploited, the oppressed. I stand with them, and ultimately, I'm the rightful ruler of the earth, and the wicked may prosper for a time, but I am coming to set things right, ultimately.